The first light of dawn crept over the distant mountains, casting a pale golden hue across the endless grasslands of Mikami. A soft mist clung to the ground, still lingering from the long rains that had finally stopped the day before. The savanna stirred to life, birds called out in short bursts. Insects buzzed faintly, and in the distance, the deep grunts and snorts of buffalo broke the quiet. A herd of more than 70 African buffalo began to move, hooves pressing softly into the damp earth as they set out to graze. Their dark bodies cut slow, steady paths through the grass, always searching for fresher, softer growth. Among them was Baro, a large, weathered bull whose horns curved wide like a crown of years. For many seasons, Baro had led the herd, through drought, flood, and the dangers of predators. But time had passed, and the younger bulls had grown. He had stepped aside, yielding leadership to a strong, silent bull half his age. There had been no fight, no ceremony, just instinct. The way things were, Baro still moved with pride, but no longer with urgency. This morning, as the herd veered north toward a ridge of acacia trees, Baro broke away. No one noticed, not right away. He walked slowly but purposefully, toward a patch of tall reeds near a shallow marsh. Rain had left the landscape lush, blades of grass glistened in the sun. Thick and green, for old bones like his. The softer ground was a comfort. The reeds swayed gently as he entered, his massive body brushing against their stalks. Baro lowered his head and began to graze, savoring the tender shoots. The air was still, heavy with moisture. He didn't hear the subtle change beneath his hooves, the sound of mud. Not grass. Not until his front legs sank slightly. He paused, shifting his weight. The ground held, but barely. What looked like solid terrain was, in truth, a layer of slick wet grass covering thick, dark mud, the kind that traps slowly. Then suddenly, Baro snorted, lifted a hoof, and tried to back away. His movement was calm, almost dismissive at first. He'd seen worse, fought worse, but as he tried again, one back leg sank deeper. The reeds rustled behind him. He turned his head, instinctively checking his surroundings. The herd was far now, moving steadily over the drier ridge. None had looked back. Baro stood still for a long moment, breathing, listening. Then he moved again, carefully, testing each step, strength still alive in his massive frame. The old bull wasn't finished yet. Not today. Just a few more steps. That was all it took before Baro slipped, his front legs giving way as he crashed into the thick, clinging mud. The weight of his massive body drove him down, the marsh swallowing him slowly, relentlessly. For a moment, there was only the wet slap of his bulk sinking and the startled cry that burst from his throat. Baro thrashed. Muscles rippled beneath his soaked hide as he twisted, kicked, and pushed against the mire. He lowered his head and swung his horns violently, digging into the mud, trying to lift himself. It only made things worse. The more he fought, the deeper he sank. The silence around him remained untouched. His bellow echoed once, ragged and hoarse, across the still swamp. It carried no strength, no direction. The herd had already disappeared beyond the tree line, a silent procession of dark shapes moving away through the morning light. None heard his call, none looked back. Barrow's struggle slowed. His breathing turned heavy, raw. Each movement pulled more strength from his limbs. Now slick with grime, the mud rose past his knees. Then his shoulders. Reeds snapped beneath his weight, their sharp ends jutting like broken spears around him. He blinked mud from his eyes. Heart pounding, vision blurring. He paused, for the first time in years. Fear wrapped around him, not the sharp fear of predators or pain, but the slow, creeping dread of being forgotten, of fading alone. Still, instinct pressed him to move. He lurched again, pushing upward, one final surge, but the effort only drove him deeper. The mud closed in around his chest like a tightening grip. With a groan, he collapsed. Time passed, hours maybe. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist. Flies buzzed lazily above the water. Somewhere nearby, a heron took flight. Barrow no longer moved. His head, heavy with exhaustion, had fallen forward. Only his horns remained above the surface, jutting from the swamp like the gnarled remains of old tree roots. Lifeless and half-buried. No sound followed. No witness stood watch. The great bull lay still in the silence of the reeds, where the land gave no mercy and time kept no record. At a ranger outpost not far from the marsh, a young ranger named Juma was finishing his morning patrol. It was his last day on duty in Mikami before transferring to a new post, a position he had dreamed of for years. A fresh start, a promotion, and a chance to build something beyond these plains he had known since his early days. The morning had been uneventful. The sun now hung higher in the sky, and the savannah shimmered under its growing heat. As his jeep rolled past a patch of tall reeds near the swamp, something caught his eye. He slowed instinctively, narrowing his gaze. In the distance, two black curves rose just above the mud. He braked, stepped out. The ground was soft beneath his boots as he approached on foot, reeds brushing against his legs. When he got close enough, his breath caught. It was a buffalo, old, motionless. Only its horns remained above the surface, twisted, weathered, half covered in muck. He stood there for a long moment, taking in the sight. A strange quiet settled over him, the kind that falls when something larger than words hangs in the air. And then, something stirred inside him, a memory. He saw his father, a strong man in ranger green, standing tall beside him years ago on this very land. His father had been a legend in the park, known for his quiet wisdom and fierce commitment to wildlife. Juma had followed in his footsteps, sometimes in awe, sometimes in doubt. On a similar morning long ago, his father had said something that never left him. Sometimes, you won't be able to save the whole herd, but if you can save even one, it's still a victory for life. Juma crouched beside the lifeless buffalo. His fingers brushed the horn, still solid despite the mud. For all he knew, this old bull had once led a herd, once stood proud in the golden grass. And now, forgotten and half-buried, but not unseen, Juma stood, his mind racing. He reached for his radio. There might still be time. Maybe not to save the buffalo, but to honor it. To document its final stand. To learn. Or maybe, just maybe, to try. Because this moment, was the reason he became a ranger in the first place. Not the transfer, not the title, this choice. And deep in his chest, something settled, a quiet promise passed down. Now his to keep. Juma didn't hesitate. He grabbed his radio and called in an emergency report. Voice steady but urgent. Within 15 minutes, help arrived, 3 familiar figures stepping out of a truck that rattled to a halt near the reeds. Amina, the park's dedicated veterinarian, carried her kit with practiced calm. Kito, the crane operator, surveyed the terrain with quick, focused eyes. And Salim, Juma's longtime colleague, friend, and quiet backbone of the ranger team, nodded once and followed Juma toward the marsh. The mud was too deep, too soft. There was no way they could lift the buffalo with ropes alone. It would do more harm than good. Kito started maneuvering the crane into place, its long arm creaking as it extended over the swamp. Amina crouched a safe distance away, binoculars in hand, watching for any signs of life. After a moment, she called out, "He's breathing, barely, but he's still with us." Hope snapped the team into motion. Juma and Salim stepped into the mud without hesitation. Wading carefully, they moved toward the sunken form of the old buffalo. His chest rose faintly, covered in a thick coat of wet earth. His eyes were closed, but there was still a flicker of life beneath the surface. They worked quickly but gently, securing a wide, padded rescue strap beneath his belly, designed to minimize internal pressure and prevent injury. Their hands moved with purpose, despite the sucking mud that fought every step. Once the harness was in place, Juma signaled to Kito. The crane groaned to life. Slowly, inch by inch, Barrow's massive body lifted from the swamp. The mud gave way with a sickening slurp as water and muck poured off his sides. His legs dangled limp, coated in black sludge, but he was out, no longer sinking. The crane swung carefully, placing Barrow on solid ground near the marsh edge. Amina rushed in immediately, injecting a dose of stimulant into his flank. Salim wiped away the mud clogging Barrow's nose and mouth, clearing his airway so he could breathe. The 4 of them stood still, watching, waiting, every breath held, every second stretched. Then, Barrow's nostrils flared. A twitch ran through his side. A low, guttural breath escaped him. He was alive. A wave of silent relief passed through the team. No cheering, no celebration, just shared glances, quiet smiles, and a deep exhale none of them realized they'd been holding. They had done it. Barrow had survived. 10 minutes passed. The sun hung higher now, casting long shadows over the reeds. Then, without warning, Barrow stirred. A small tremor ran through his body. His head shifted, just slightly, and his eyes opened. They were clouded with age but still deep, like wells that had seen countless seasons. His gaze found Juma. For a long moment, the old bull stared at the man who had pulled him back from the edge. Juma didn't speak. He simply placed a hand gently on Barrow's shoulder. A quiet gesture of respect between 2 survivors of the grasslands. Barrow blinked once. Then, with effort, he pushed himself up. His legs shook beneath him, but they held, slow and steady. He stood, mud dripping from his flanks, chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. He didn't roar, he didn't run, he simply stood, gathering what strength he had left. No one moved, no one gave an order. They didn't have to. Juma, Amina, Salim, and Kito all took a quiet step back, creating space. The wild was returning to its own rhythm. Nature didn't need applause. Barrow began to walk, one step, then another. His pace was slow, deliberate, but there was no doubt in his stride. He passed the line of reeds. The mud, the crane, and the people, each step taking him closer to the vast, sunlit expanse beyond. When he reached the middle of the field, he stopped. He turned. His massive head lifted slightly. And for just a heartbeat, he looked back at the rescue team. There were no words, no sounds, but something in his eyes, some quiet glint of recognition, passed between them. A thank you, spoken in the only language the wild ever needed. Then he turned again and kept walking. Into the tall grass. Toward the horizon. Toward the herd that waited somewhere out of sight. The grass swallowed him slowly. Until only the tips of his horns could be seen. Then nothing. Juma watched him go. His boots still caked in mud. His hand frozen mid-air, as if still reaching. Beside him, Amina finally broke the silence. You think you'll remember your last shift here? She asked softly. Almost playfully. Juma didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the grass. Where Baro had disappeared. A small smile touched his lips. For the rest of my life, he said.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.